Hey, what's going on YouTube? Welcome back. Listen, I figured we'd do today a little controller tier list, and I know what you're thinking, Brian, don't you hate tier lists? Aren't all tier lists garbage? Yes, all tier lists are garbage. They're just for fun. They're just so that you can either validate your own feelings or get pissed off that someone disagrees with your opinion. That said, go ahead and get all your upset comments out of the way, get them in the chat or get them into the comment section below. But really the point of this is really to put a wrapper around my opinion on what controllers are good for Street Fighter, focusing mostly on 4 and 5 and the pros and cons of each controller, because we all know there's been a big debate around arcade sticks, hitboxes, and regular old pads for consoles. So let's break down the pros and cons of each controller and rank them in a tier list today. All right, you know we got to start off with the defaults, the thing that started it all. Good old-fashioned arcade stick. All right, this is the first one we'll be breaking down a little bit. So I wanted to go into the pros and cons of each controller, and we'll start with the pros for arcade stick. Listen, it's a classic. Arcade stick is what it all started on. This is what the genre was initially intended to be played on. You know, you had all 4 cardinal directions controlled by the lever there on the left side, and you generally have at least 6 to 8 attack buttons. You know what? Arcade stick is cool. You look cool playing on an arcade stick. It feels badass playing on an arcade stick. Usually the buttons have a lot of clickety-clackety action sound, so that's really awesome. Clickety-clackety. That was one of the big pros for me coming from playing pad originally. There's also clickety-clackety effects on the arcade stick itself. Now, if you play Square Gate, then this is the reference I'm judging with here is Square Gate. If you play Octogate, you're deducted a few points here for cool points and for functionality. And if you play Circle Gate, then your stick should be burned in a fire. So I'm going to be basing my pros and cons here based on the default Square Gate arcade stick, right? So let's get into some actual nitty-gritty pros. When you're playing on an arcade stick, one of the big things that's important is the button layout, the action layout. I think having all of your attack buttons be equal in action is very good. So equal action on all buttons, right? So compare this to something like a PS4 pad, a regular pad. You have all these different buttons on the face and on the shoulders and the triggers here, and they all activate at different actions, right? Some buttons require more depression than others to activate. So I think this mattered a lot more in Street Fighter 4 than Street Fighter 5. Because in Street Fighter 4 and in other fighting games that have really tight link timings, that is really important. I feel like it's a bit easier to do techniques such as easier to plink, consistent timing on links, Street Fighter 4. So I think it is slightly advantageous on arcade stick compared to something like a pad, something with the button layout to have that sort of action across all the buttons. I think certain techniques are easier on this. So you can do things such as pianoing. I don't know if you spell it that way. I just spell piano. Why is my brain saying that's wrong? Piano-ing, whatever you want to say. So doing things like Honda hands, electricity, and Gen hands when you're looking at the older versions of the game that required 5 inputs of attack buttons to activate those moves. In Street Fighter 5, I believe they reduced all the mash type moves to 4, so it's a lot more viable on pad. In Street Fighter 4, that was a big deal, right? Same thing for like sliding for these mashed out moves. A common technique with Gen in Street Fighter 4, he would have crouching strong to hands. You would start on crouching medium punch and just slide left to right, and that would give you the 5 inputs, which is something that you couldn't do on PS4 pad. Like I said, not as relevant in Street Fighter 5, very relevant in Street Fighter 4. I think what you'll see is a lot of the changes made to modern Street Fighter games make arcade stick less and less relevant. Spoiler for later on. Any other techniques here? So let's see, easier techniques on the lever. So there are actually some advantages, I think, to the lever. The big thing is intuitive for sure. Whenever you think of the motion inputs, the directions you have to input for a fighting game, for a special move, it's always mapped to a shape. An arcade stick, if you do a quarter circle forward for Fireball, it's very easy to visualize tracing the quarter circle. You go down, down, forward, forward. So there's a very easy geometric pattern to follow for you to intuitively get what the motion is describing on arcade stick. So that is definitely a huge one. But I also think that certain motions, like if we compare to non-leverless, things like half circles, I think half circles are much easier. How about this? Blurs your inputs. So the thing about arcade stick that's big is that you don't have to precisely input the directions you're trying to do. You need to approximate the shape. So if I need to do a half circle, I can very easily swing my stick around. And as long as I start hitting some of these points when I'm, making these very ungraceful and maybe over exaggerated shapes with my arcade stick, I'm hitting extra directions, I'm not being very precise with it. As long as I get the general shape, it will guide you with the gate and allow you to get the input, right? You have basically guardrails. You have the bumper plates like you do when you're going bowling. So that's definitely, I think, an advantage of stick. When you do leverless inputs, you have to precisely type in your code. It's like dialing in a code versus tracing the shape. So sometimes having the guardrails to help you color in the lines is really useful for doing some of these larger inputs, for sure. For sure. All right, let's get into some cons here. One big con is it's huge. This is going to be a common theme, but if you play on a pad, dude, pad is just, you put it in your pocket and you go. It's a big thing. It's a big commitment. It's hard to move around. All right, so that's definitely a drawback. Kind of expensive. I mean, this is kind of, I don't really know if I agree with this point too much. PS4 pads, regular pads are cheaper. However, they often don't last as long. If you get a good stick, it's definitely durable. I think the value of a stick is better than a PlayStation pad for sure, but the upfront cost is higher. Let's get into the actual lever. Lever is slow, okay? Dashing is slow. You have to travel 1,000,000 miles, 1,000,000 miles to move from neutral. So arcade stick, you flick it, it returns to neutral. It has a spring, which is a great feature, right? This is actually a pro because you automatically return to neutral. But when you dash in Street Fighter 4 or 5, you have to hit forward, return to neutral, hit forward. So this doesn't seem like that much motion, but compared to this is actually 1,000,000 years. So it is objectively slower to dash using a lever on a button of this height. It'll always just be this action. It'll always be yay fast. And that really manifests itself in a huge difference in how dashing behaves, especially in a game like Street Fighter 5, where dashing is so critical to the meta, right? Also, one thing that this is another silly one, right? It's loud. I remember thinking about this very heavily. I used to play 801 Strider a lot at tournaments. We'd be in a silent ass hotel room. You could hear a pencil drop. It's just us playing. He would check all of my dashes with Balrog, and Balrog is a good dashing character. And I slowly started realizing, I'm like, dude, you're hearing me dash far before I actually dash. And then I saw him play like Travis Styles and other pad Balrog players, and they were able to sneak dashes on him. And I realized on pad, you can't hear them dashing. You can't hear it. It's silent. And I realized, dude, like not only are my dashes objectively slower, they're telling them in advance. So, ideally in competitive play, you wouldn't be side by side, or you wouldn't be in a quiet room, and you'd be head to head, so they can't really hear it that well. But 100% hearing your dash will make a difference. Like, it sounds stupid, but it really does change. Audio cues are always processed faster than visual ones. That's a real thing. So it actually kind of does matter. So yeah, lever, kind of the inverse of it blurring your inputs. The lever is less precise. There's zones between the gates where, your arcade stick is not in the fully pressed position where you're in the corner, you're in the corner of the gate, you're pressing directly to the cardinal direction of left, right, up, and down. But like you're returning back to neutral, it's still holding that direction for a period of time, right? There's action to all of your directional presses and releases. Also, you don't have access to opposite direction, which will become a big deal later on in this video. There's no SOCD. So SOCD stands for, say it with me, chat, simultaneous opposing cardinal directions. Woo! Everyone's favorite topic. You're limited by the physical analog input of the lever, right? So as I'm holding left, I can't also hit right. Not every controller is like that. So the stick, the lever, is unique in the fact that it is totally restricted in this way. We'll see why that is in a bit. There's other components you can think of in this piece of hardware, but honestly, arcade stick is mostly good. I think it has some drawbacks, and it doesn't have the pros of other controllers, but it is classic, it is solid. It is the go-to controller for the vast majority of fighting game players, and it does definitely get the job done, and it's the most fun to play on, in my opinion. I still think arcade stick is by far the most fun. So For our first controller, I'm going to throw Arcade Stick into a solid A tier. It's good, has its drawbacks, has its pros, but it's definitely not S tier. Definitely not. All right, let's get into the next one. PS4/PS5 pad. We're just talking about the default pad that comes with the console that we're playing on. But I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty between PS4 and PS5 and Xbox 360 and all that. I'm just doing a basic overall pad overview for Street Fighter 4 and Street Fighter 5. So let's go over the pros. So we mentioned this in the Arcade Stick one for reference, right? So like a big one is D-pad is fast. D-pad is exceptionally fast for moving around. Dashing is hella quick on a PS4 pad. You just press the button. Moving around, going from left to right, also has less action than a lever as well. Travel time is much shorter. You can also, you can get your fingers on top of it and quickly depress opposite directions as fast as possible. It's just a lot faster. There's less travel time on a D-pad. It's very, very quick to do your actions. This also means that your movement is more precise, right? So one thing I didn't touch upon with the stick is the fact that because you can walk forward and then go to back, you can do things like walk very small amounts of distance and then block. If you can walk and block effectively in Street Fighter, you can change the spacing in a much more effective manner than someone who can't. Imagine like someone's zoning you, you're able to gain a little bit of ground before each fireball and block it, and then walk forward and block on reaction, walk forward, block. You can start pressuring them and move closer and closer. If you can't walk forward, then quickly press back, what's going to happen is you're going to walk straight into a fireball, block too late, get hit, get knocked back, lose health, and lose ground. So effective movement, like just subtle walking and blocking, is huge for high-level gameplay, and the D-pad is 100% more effective at that than Arcade Stick. Absolutely. Let's also do some of the obvious ones. I kind of glossed over that. Listen, it's light. Small, easy to carry, comes with your console. So the D-pad, honestly, I think this is the big thing. I just think D-pad is definitely superior in a lot of situations than Arcade Stick, but there are some pros and cons to this as well. But I just think movement and dashing are so much better in Street Fighter on pad. Now, one other weird thing is you can also do SOCD tricks, because not only do you have the pad, if that's not your cup of tea, you can use the joystick here, which is pretty much like a lever, an arcade stick that you control with your thumb. It basically operates mostly the same way, but it's like a circle gate for an arcade stick. So you could use that, but you can also use both at the same time in Street Fighter 4 and 5. And I know the comments are going to be like, oh, nobody does that. Nobody does that, Brian. You've already been ranting about this. SOCD tricks on pad. Nobody does that. People do it. People do it. They do it. Just because you don't do it doesn't mean people don't do it. Most of people are not good at Street Fighter. Most people are not competitive players. I know competitive players that do it. You don't know that. So I just have to throw that out there because I always get this argument that people don't do that. People do it. They do it. So an example I put out is with Guile, you can do a flash kick input where you hold down on the D-pad, and then you do up on the joystick here, the analog stick here, and then do flash kick. That gives you a perfect flash kick where basically you never stand when doing your flash kick, and it lets you duck underneath things and punish things that you otherwise cannot do without doing this trick. So an arcade stick cannot do a perfect flash kick. It just physically cannot. But pad can, because you can use both these directional sticks, and there's other techniques as well. But there's certain SOCD tricks that are used in competitive play by certain players that you have access to. So that is a pro of PS4 pad. Any other pros here? I just think it being light, the movement is definitely the main thing for sure. Cons. Different action buttons. So this is not as big a deal in Street Fighter 5, but the fact that you have these face buttons that have different action than the bumpers and the triggers adds a level of inconsistency, which can make things pretty hard for timing precise buttons all at the same time, right? It's pretty easy when you have the same relative timing to activate your buttons like on an arcade stick. And in a game like Street Fighter 4, where there's very tight link timings, I feel like that was a bit of a challenge, a bit awkward to get over. However, it's not that big a deal. Like, just look to somebody like Smug, who is the Dudley in Street Fighter 4, doing one frame links all over the place all day. He played on an Xbox 360 pad, so obviously it's not the end of the world, but it can make things like timing your links a bit awkward, and also doing techniques like plinking a bit harder because you have to plink between different buttons with different actions. Because Street Fighter V has the very generous link buffer, I feel like this is not really that relevant at all for Street Fighter V. This is definitely more relevant for tighter link games like Street Fighter 4, and it also probably won't be relevant for Street Fighter 6, to be honest. Yeah, the pads themselves, they break often. SOCD tricks are limited and a little awkward. So yeah, you can't do every SOCD trick that you could do on, say, a hitbox. You do have access to some, but yeah, I do agree that it's not the most intuitive thing. So it's not like hitbox level SOCD tricks, but it's definitely up there. Oh, I can say that charging can hurt thumbs. I've heard this complaint on arcade stick. You have a cozy home for down back to hold charge, but I've heard some players complain that charging can hurt their thumbs. Like I know Idom doesn't like charging, and Punk doesn't like charging on PS4 pad because it hurts his thumbs. But I also know a ton of Guile players who play pad. Kaba plays pad. He's one of the best Guiles in the world, bar none. So it's not really that much of a deterrent, but it can be maybe a little less comfy than arcade stick, because holding down back on an arcade stick does feel good on a square gate. It is home. So that could be a little bit more stressful on your thumbs to constantly be pressing down back like that. But yeah, also Knuckle Do plays PS4 pad, so it's not that big of a deal. It's just a minor thing. I think it might be a little bit more cozy on arcade stick. But really, that's about it. I think pad is an amazing controller for Street Fighter right now. I think it was a little bit less beneficial in Street Fighter 4 because dashing wasn't as critical in that game, and also because links were tighter in that game. I think arcade stick benefited from having the different face button layouts like that, and I think that was, you know, a big deal in Street Fighter 4. But Street Fighter 5, I think Street Fighter 5 is meant to be played mostly on this controller. This controller is so good for so many things in Street Fighter 5. The movement, the buffering you can do for things like SPD, the SOCD tricks, the fact that there's a big buffer in the input leniency, so you don't need to worry about link timings. Pad, I think from now and until the future, is definitely going to be an S tier controller. I think pad is superior than arcade stick in the current generation of games. There could be some characters that benefit more from arcade stick than pad, but I think overall pad has more uses than arcade stick for sure in the modern generation of Street Fighter. All right, we're getting into the next big one, but before we get into that, if you're still watching the video, I do appreciate that. Most people would have dropped off by now, but you stuck around. So if you're enjoying the content, feel free to subscribe to the channel. We're getting real close to 90K, which means we're getting close to 100K subs. So if you enjoy what we do here on the channel, you want to subscribe to support that, I can really appreciate that. And you can leave a comment in the comment section here saying blue toad rabbits to let me know that you made it to this part of the video. I'll be looking out for that. But that said, we're getting into, you know, the final territory. We're going to be talking about it. You know we have to talk about it. We got to talk about the hitbox. But before we do that, let's call out some honorable mentions here. Let's talk about this thing. I don't know what you even call this. This is what people used to refer to when they said pad. Back in the Street Fighter 4 era, it was so uncommon for people to use this thing. Oh, fight pad. Thank you, chat. Fight pad. It was less common for people to use the default console controller than it was for them to use this thing. This type of fight pad has definitely died off a lot since the Street Fighter 4 era. It's not common anymore. They have all the attack buttons on the same face so that they have the same action here, and people would actually play them thumb on the D-pad, gripping it like a normal controller, but right hand over the top, pressing the buttons. I've seen that. You could do either using your thumb or over the top like that. To me, it's like kind of an outdated controller. I don't know. It's a weird type of controller to me. I've never used one of these. I don't see these too often anymore. They do exist. I just want to give a shout out to this thing. It has the D-pad. That's the big deal to me for Street Fighter 5. For Street Fighter 4, I totally get this button layout for doing certain techniques like we mentioned with arcade stick, the pianoing, the sliding, things like that, and having equal access to the link timings. So I don't know where I would throw this on the tier list, but you know, this is still sort of around, just not really talked about anymore. I'm just gonna throw it in B tier because it's around. I don't know. B for I don't know. All right, we have one more honorable mention. It's the Korean style bat top lever. Now, if you're using this controller, you're playing the wrong game. Either you're a very confused NRS Mortal Kombat boomer and you're wondering why the button layout isn't like in an X shape, or you should be playing Tekken. This is 100% an arcade stick for Tekken, and I'm not going to speak onto the effectiveness of pad versus Korean lever for Tekken. But yeah, I don't know. Don't use bat top for Street Fighter. I don't have any good reason to say that other than you'll get weird looks. That's all I'll say about it. Honestly, it could be great. I have no idea. I've never played on one of these. It's generally used for Tekken because I think for the movement options in Tekken, they like to have a lot of recoil on the stick to do things like Korean backdash and dash blocking and things like that. So it's good to have like the recoil on the bat top, and I believe it's because you can slide your hands off it more easily. I don't really know. Not a Tekken player, not a Tekken expert, but yeah, if you play one of these in Street Fighter, it's just really unusual to see, to be honest. We'll throw that in the honorable mentioned category. Actually, no, we'll put that down here. Don't use that for Street Fighter. All right. You know what time it is. Time to talk about really why we're making this video. The Hitbox, aka the leverless controller. Hitbox is the name brand for the most recognizable leverless controller, which I think is a bad name for this category of controller because it's defining the controller by what it doesn't have, which is a lever. It doesn't have the arcade stick, the lever here. Instead, it uses buttons, all independent buttons, just like the attack buttons, to define the movement for the controller. It is definitely a controversial controller. Let's talk about the pros for it, which will unveil the controversy here. Pros, it has individual actionable buttons for all the directions. So you have independent access to all directions at once. So if you notice something with the arcade stick and the pad traditionally, you can't do things like press left and right at the same time or up and down at the same time. However, there is nothing physically stopping you from inputting these directions at the same time and sending that information to the game. So that allows you to do certain things that many people argue are not only not intentional by the developers, but almost cheating. Like, people say this is cheating. I don't really agree with that. In my opinion, I think the software needs to handle this. But people go so far as to call Hitbox cheat box and these types of controllers actually cheating. We can talk about a bit about why that is. We'll bring this term up again. SOCD tricks. Okay, remember simultaneous opposing cardinal directions. Now it could be opposite. I always say opposing and I misspell everything, so don't roast me for my spelling in the comments, please. So SOCD tricks. We mentioned it before, doing things like perfect flash kick. That is a huge benefit to a hitbox. This big red button down here, the big one, it's just begging you to press it. This is the up button. Left, down, right, up. And what this allows you to do is you can do things like hold down, and then you can press your attack button and then jump button at the same time. So you hold down. While you're holding down, you can come over to this side and you can just press your attack button and the jump button at the same time. That easily. Normally on an arcade stick, because of the travel time, you go down, you go to neutral, then you go to up. You're actually standing up, then your special move comes out. That means that your flash kicks are slower on arcade stick, and they're also more susceptible to being jumped in on because you stand up. On Hitbox, you go from crouching immediately into flash kick. So you can also punish things that are actually impossible to punish without that because you skip that standing frame. There's many advanced techniques for perfect flash kick. Another thing is input shortcuts. Normally on arcade stick and pad, you can only hit these directions one at a time, left or right, up or down. You can't do both at the same time. What should happen if I hit left and right at the same time? What should happen if I hit up and down at the same time? Well, if you send those raw inputs to the game for Street Fighter V, if you do left and right at the same time, you actually always walk towards the opponent. And if you hit up and down at the same time, it gives you up. On Hitbox, if you hit left and right at the same time, at the hardware level, it cancels out the input and you're just standing still. That means that pressing left and right at the same time gives you nothing. You add up these shortcuts together, the fact that this gives you nothing, you start getting weird situations where you can do super by holding forward and just tapping. Now, if you follow along, it's forward, and then you hold all three buttons. Left and right gives you nothing. While you're holding the down, all three buttons give you down. This ends up giving you super. So I don't want to get too derailed on all the nitty gritty of all these weird shortcuts, but because of the L plus R equals neutral input, this results in many different input shortcuts for things like CA, DP, etc. There's many different input shortcuts where you can actually shave off the number of inputs required physically because you can kind of exploit both the input interpreter and the SOCD tricks to shave off the number of directions you have to hit. Objectively, once you get good at it, you objectively shave off the number of frames it takes to input certain things. 100%. That is the big deal. So the next thing is movement is the most precise. This is huge. We talked about walking and blocking with pad already. Take that to the next level. It is next level with Hitbox. So once you nail and learn the execution for movement, your walking and blocking, it's way more precise. You're wiggling around, it's way more precise. You cannot compare the movement on Hitbox to arcade stick. It is just vastly superior movement. It is more challenging to learn and to implement, but your movement is 100% more precise. And that's really about it. I mean, I guess I could say this. Charging is more precise, which is why it's a perfect Guile controller. Going from left to right on a charge move, you can instantly release the button and go back to charging right away. So because there's no travel time, when you lose your charge by activating a sonic boom or a special move like back to forward, you can much more fast English, because you can go from left to right and then release your button right away and immediately go back to charging. You can much more quickly go back to charging after releasing your charge by activating the attack. It's just not comparable to arcade stick. That travel time reduces the amount of frames you have to charge. So you in fact can unlock certain situations where you can get access to charge and do certain punishes or certain like zoning sequences that you just cannot do on arcade stick. It's not easy and it's not like that game breaking, but you for sure get access to techniques that you can't do on arcade stick and pad at the very highest level. It's also good for other characters and other styles as well, but like there's no drawbacks at all for playing a character like Guile. It's just perfect for a charge-based character with a flash kick. Like there's no drawbacks whatsoever. So if you play Guile, you should definitely play Hitbox, 100%. Let's talk about some cons, because believe it or not, I do think there are cons to the Hitbox. I've been playing it for over a month now, and I still have a lot of challenges with this controller. The highest tier of complaint I have, it's non-intuitive. Okay, so we talked about how cool that stick was. Stick was very intuitive. You kind of get it. You kind of map out the shapes and you draw within the lines and you're happy, right? Hitbox is not like that at all. Instead of having any kind of geometric shape to map to when you do a special move, you're basically dialing in a code. You have to learn the code. Quarter circle forward, it's very strange, right? It's down, down, forward, forward. You have to learn the code. 1, 2, 3. Right? Half circles, 1, 2, 3 to do. So rather than just tracing the shape, I have to move my fingers all independently and memorize the input, especially when I'm doing like the SOCD shortcuts. The inputs don't make any sense. There's no shape behind them. So it's very non-intuitive to learn different things. Also, it's very contextual. So what do I mean by that? Your last input will very heavily influence how you do your next input. Because there's so many SOCD tricks and so many shortcuts, they don't all work depending on what you were previously holding. Like if you're holding certain inputs and then you try to go into another input, you might have different options to do your next input, if that makes sense. It's getting really complicated, but you'll understand that based on what you're currently holding, the next code you got to remember to dial in to do your next move will vary. So it becomes more complex, I think, in a lot of ways. You have to learn a lot more different ways to input the same move. So it becomes pretty bloated, I think, for a while. So it takes a decent amount of time to learn. And I think the high skills, you'll get like the first 80% of your strength on a pad or stick on Hitbox in a month. But then that last 20%, there's going to be situations where you're going to not know how to do things. Like it's very hard to do things on the fly on Hitbox, and you're going to realize there's a lot of gaps in your knowledge of how to execute certain things. So specific things that are difficult, half circles, right? I've said this before. It's not just the half circle. Half circle, you just roll across, right? That's a half circle. But if I'm holding down back or I'm holding forward and then I need to quickly do a half circle in another direction, it's difficult to stop your current action, then quickly do a large sweeping motion like a half circle or a 360, right? Because you don't get to just swing your arcade stick around. You have to dial in the code. It can be very difficult because you have to also, this is the big one, negative edge. You have to time the releasing of your directional inputs. If you input the direction you intend to do, but don't lift your finger off the other direction, it will mess you up. So I'm holding down back that I need to do a quarter circle forward. I can't just start pressing forward. I have to release these fingers, then go forward and then go back down with them. That is very, very difficult to do on the fly and really quickly when you're not very experienced with it. On an arcade stick, you cannot do that. That is not something you have to worry about. You have to spend a lot more mental energy to pull your fingers off the directions and then place the next one and have it all synchronized. So you're constantly worried about releasing buttons, right? So that will lead to other things like you'll realize your fingers are weak. Your ring finger will be your detriment. Dashing to the left by pressing left will be a big problem for you. In fact, it's such a big problem for me that when I dash to the left, I don't even dash to the left with my ring finger. I do a stupid shortcut where I hold left and then I do this. Because for some reason, if I hold left and then tap right, it'll give me a dash left. So once again, my weak finger means I need to learn an SOCD trick that is non-intuitive to get what I want. Do you understand how this is all coming together? All these points, it's all very weird. It's all very weird. And then you're gonna have to, min-max your focus here on like what kind of shortcuts you want to use. Is your finger strong enough? All these things all come together. You're using a lot of brain power on this controller, a lot. But that said, these are cons. I don't think if you play a character that is a ton of half circles, like I know we don't have this character in Street Fighter, but Gold Lewis from Guilty Gear is literally all half circles. I would never in a million years wish on my worst enemy for them to play Hitbox Gold Lewis. It is designed to be used with the intuitive nature of tracing the directions on your arcade stick, right? So characters that use a lot of these, I wouldn't recommend. Charge characters, 100%. Characters with basic quarter circles and all that, your movement will be better. The benefits definitely outweigh the cons. I mean, there's so much potential with this controller. So many high-level tricks. Like you can really push the limits of the game with this controller by having access to all the different inputs. I think the skill ceiling is much higher on this controller. Definitely certain things become easier on a Hitbox and certain things become harder, but regardless, I think there's more potential. Even if there's also really, really difficult potential where it'll be impossible to reach on stick, very difficult to do on Hitbox, but that potential is there. So if you're interested about pushing the limits of the game, this is the controller for you, in my opinion. Now, like I said, because of those limits, some people think it's cheating. I don't know, it's legal in CPT. I don't think it's cheating. In my opinion, as long as you have one way to input every individual direction. But yeah, definitely an interesting controller for sure, causing a lot of controversy today in the Street Fighter scene. And that's why it is an S tier controller. And you know what? I still think Pad is almost as good as Hitbox. I'll put them in the same tier. Maybe Hitbox would be number one. I think Pad's movement is just behind Hitbox. It still has access to the big things like perfect flash kick that Hitbox offers, just in a less ergonomic fashion. But Pad has so many other pros. I mean, it's so simple. It's a small, lightweight, intuitive controller. Half circles and 360s are very easy on it. It's very grappler friendly if you play grapplers. And I really think that Pad is an awesome controller for modern Street Fighter games. I really see no reason to not use it. Unfortunately, I think arcade sticks kind of bunk. It's the funnest controller to play with in my opinion, but I think either one of these controllers are the ideal one. I'm going to use arcade stick for certain things for sure, still competitively, because I don't feel like relearning Pad. But I just think Pad is better, and I think Hitbox is better. But no matter what you play on, the most important thing is that you play on whatever is fun and comfortable for you. That's what's important. And that's my controller tier list. It was really just an excuse to break down my thoughts on all these controllers, and hopefully you found that enjoyable as well. As always, if you enjoyed the discussion, enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe. It really does support the channel and helps me out a lot. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.